The barn was already screaming when Bridget Holloway moved toward it. Not away. Toward. Every ranch hand on Blackstone's payroll stood frozen at a safe distance. Grown men, weathered men, men who'd worked cattle through blizzards and drought, and things that would break most people, and not one of them took a single step forward. The horses inside were shrieking. The smoke was black and ugly and alive. And this woman, this heavy-set stranger who'd wandered onto the property not 4 hours ago, was running straight into the mouth of it. Nobody believed she'd make it out. They were wrong about that. They'd be wrong about a lot of things. If this story already has you gripping your seat, you're exactly where we want you. Stay until the end. Hit that like button and drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. The fire had started in the east corner of the barn, near the old tack wall where someone had left a lantern burning too close to a pile of dry straw. That was the story going around later anyway. Nobody could say for certain how it began. By the time anyone noticed the glow cutting through the dusk, the east wall was already gone, just a skeleton of blackened timber breathing orange. And the horses and the 2 milk cows Gavin Mercer kept for the house were kicking themselves raw against their stall doors. Bridget had been standing near the bunkhouse when she heard the first real scream. Not from a person. From the mare, the brown one with the white blaze, the one that had shied away from her earlier that afternoon when she'd walked past with her travel bag. The sound was not something she could describe afterward in any neat or useful way. It was just wrong. The kind of wrong that moves your body before your mind has caught up. She was running before she'd made a decision to run. "Hey!" one of the hands called out. She didn't stop. The heat hit her about 20 feet from the barn doors, a solid wall of it, the kind that dries your eyes and cracks your lips in the same second. She pulled her jacket up over her mouth and pushed through. Inside was chaos. The east wall was entirely lost. The fire had climbed the support beams and was spreading sideways across the ceiling in long orange fingers, reaching toward the west end where most of the animals were. The smoke sat heavy at chest height and was dropping fast. She couldn't see more than 8 feet in any direction. She went toward the noise. The brown mare was in the 3rd stall on the left. The door latch had warped in the heat and wouldn't lift straight. Bridget worked it sideways, found the angle, pulled it open. The mare came out like a shot and nearly knocked her flat. She let it go. It would find its own way out. The 2 milk cows were together in the wide end stall. One had gone down on its front knees. Panic, not injury, she guessed. She got the stall door open and slapped the standing one hard on the flank, and it moved, dragging the other one up by instinct the way cattle sometimes do. Both out. There were 2 more horses. She found one by sound, following the banging against wood, and got the door open. The last one, a big bay gelding at the far end, had gone completely still, which was somehow worse than the ones that were screaming. She could barely see it through the smoke. She got to the stall, found the latch, threw the door wide, and the horse didn't move. "Come on," she said out loud, not to herself. She grabbed the halter with both hands and pulled sideways, not straight back, the way her father had taught her. Don't fight their direction, change their angle. The bay stumbled sideways out of the stall, and then its legs found the floor, and it was moving past her, toward the light at the barn doors. She followed it out. The night air hit her like cold water. She stumbled 2 steps past the door and bent over with her hands on her knees, coughing until her ribs ached. Her jacket was smoking at the shoulder. She hadn't noticed. One of the hands, a short, stocky man she hadn't met yet, appeared beside her and said something she didn't catch. She straightened up and looked back at the barn. The roof was going now, the center beam sagging. The whole east end collapsed inward with a sound like a cannon shot, throwing a column of sparks straight up into the dark sky. All 5 animals were standing in the yard, breathing hard, none of them on fire. She'd been inside less than 4 minutes. Nobody said anything to her directly for a long moment. They stood around the burning barn watching it go, and a few of them looked at her, and then looked away, and then looked at her again. She was aware of it. She was used to being looked at. She'd been plus-size her whole adult life, tall and broad-shouldered, and she'd spent enough time in enough strange places to know the texture of different kinds of stares. This one was new. She couldn't quite place it yet. Gavin Mercer came out of the main house at a run, still pulling his coat on one arm. He was a tall man, somewhere in his mid-40s, dark-haired, going gray at the temples, with the kind of face that looked like it had been set hard by a lot of years of things not going the way they were supposed to. He stopped at the edge of the firelight and looked at the barn, and the look on his face was not grief exactly. It was something quieter than grief, something further along. "Horses?" he said. "All out," said the stocky hand. Then after a pause, "She got 'em." Mercer looked at Bridget. She was still catching her breath, her jacket still trailing a thin thread of smoke from the right shoulder seam. "You one of the new hands they sent from Darrow?" he said. "No," she said. "I'm not anything yet. I came to ask about the cook job." She'd seen a hand-lettered notice tacked to the post at the crossroads town 4 miles east. "Cook needed, Blackstone Ranch. Inquire at the gate." She'd inquired. A man at the gate had told her to wait by the bunkhouse, and she'd been waiting when the fire started. Gavin Mercer looked at her for a moment, then at what was left of his barn, then back at her. "You've got the job," he said. He walked past her toward the burning structure, hands in his coat pockets, and stood there watching it burn the way a man watches something he's already decided he can't save. Hut 2. She started the next morning. The ranch house kitchen was a disaster. Not dramatically, not in any way that would make a good story. It was the disaster of neglect, of a household that had stopped caring about itself some time ago and let things slide quietly into dysfunction. The pantry shelves were half empty, what was there was poorly organized, half the dry goods had moisture damage, and the wood stove had a draft problem that made it smoke when the wind came out of the northwest. Bridget had seen worse. She'd cooked in mining camps and logging camps, and one summer spent at a relay station on the eastern trail that served 40 men 3 meals a day, with 2 other women and a stove that had a cracked firebox. She knew how to make something from not much, and she knew how to take a disorganized space and find the order hidden inside it. She started by pulling everything out and putting it back where it made sense. She was quiet about it. She didn't ask for help. The ranch employed 7 men full-time and 2 part-time during busy seasons. The full-time hands were Roy, the stocky one from the fire, who turned out to be the foreman; Cal, who was young and had a smart mouth that he used more than he had the skill to back up; Walt, older, quiet, probably the most competent of the group; Hector, a solid worker who mostly kept to himself; Denny, who was cheerful in a way that seemed genuine rather than performed; and 2 others named Shep and Arnett, who Bridget took longer to form opinions of. They ate breakfast at 6:30. She put out biscuits, salt pork, eggs from the hen house, and coffee that was actually drinkable because she'd found a problem with the way the old grounds were being reused too many times. Cal, who was maybe 22, looked at his plate and then at her. "These the good biscuits or the regular ones?" he said. "They're biscuits," she said. "The last cook made 'em flat as boot leather." "Then you've been eating boot leather," she said. "These are biscuits." Roy snorted into his coffee. Walt said nothing but ate 3 of them, which she took as a more reliable endorsement. The ribbing continued through breakfast, low grade and not particularly mean, the kind of testing that happens when someone new arrives and the group hasn't decided what to do with them yet. She let it run off. She refilled coffee cups when they ran low and didn't say much else. After breakfast, she walked the property. Nobody told her to. Nobody was paying her to. She just walked, because she'd learned a long time ago that a place tells you things if you pay attention to it, and she'd seen enough of Blackstone's land in her approach to know there was something to look at. The ranch covered roughly 4,000 acres in the bowl of a shallow valley surrounded on 3 sides by low ridge lines. The grass should have been good, the elevation was right, the soil looked deep, and the range of hills suggested protection from the worst of the wind. But it wasn't good. It was thin and sparse and yellow in patches where it should have been green. The cattle she could see from the fence line looked undersized for the time of year, their ribs too visible, their movement too slow. There was a creek on the eastern property line. She walked to it. It was running, but barely, a thin thread of water moving over a cracked bed that had clearly once carried a lot more. She crouched at the bank and looked at it for a long time. Then she looked upstream, past where the fence line cut across the water's path. She didn't say anything to anyone that day, but she filed it away. Hut 3. The hands made their position on her clear within the first week, not through any single dramatic confrontation, but through the accumulation of small things. Cal said, within earshot of her, and apparently not caring if she heard, "Gavin hiring a woman this size to do physical work. Somebody's losing their mind." Hector didn't say anything, but watched her with a skepticism so constant it had become a kind of wallpaper. Roy, who was theoretically in charge of the hands, told her in a relatively decent tone on her third day that she should stay in the kitchen and not wander the property. "It's not your business," he said. "Mercer runs the ranch. We run the cattle. You run the kitchen. That's how it works." "All right," she said. She kept walking the property on her own time. She had found something on the second day, on her walk along the eastern fence line, that she couldn't let go of. The creek's flow problem wasn't from drought alone. She'd seen drought-fed water loss before, and this wasn't the same pattern. The soil at the creek bank was wrong, too dense, too compacted in specific places, in a way that suggested something blocking the natural subsurface movement of water rather than simple surface evaporation. And the old fence line that cut across the creek's path was anchored by posts that were older than the rest of the property's fencing by what looked like several decades. Heavier timber, a different style of construction. They didn't match. Her father had spent 20 years working land surveys and drainage engineering in the Northern Territories before his health broke. She'd followed him around those job sites from age 8 to age 18, carrying his tools and handing him things and asking questions while he answered them. She knew what blocked subsurface drainage looked like, and she knew what it did to land over time, and she was fairly certain that what she was looking at was something that could be fixed. She brought it up to Gavin Mercer on a Sunday, which she'd learned was the one day he took an hour to drink coffee on the front porch after the morning work. She came around the corner of the house and stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. He looked up from his coffee with an expression that wasn't quite welcoming but wasn't hostile either. "I have a question," she said. Go ahead. "That old fence line along the East Creek, the one that cuts across the water path, how old is it?" He looked at her for a moment. "My father-in-law built it, 1851 or thereabouts. It's a survey marker." "It might be more than that," she said. "The posts are driven deep, deeper than they need to be for a marker line, and the soil at the base of them is wrong. Have you ever had the land surveyed for subsurface drainage?" He set his coffee cup down. "Why would you know anything about subsurface drainage?" "My father did survey work. I spent a lot of time on job sites." He looked at her the way people look at something they've categorized one way and are being asked to recategorize. It was the same look as after the barn fire, but more cautious this time, less gratitude in it. "The water's down," he said slowly. "It's been down for 3 seasons. We figured it was the drought." "It might not just be the drought," she said. "I think the subsurface channel under that fence line might be blocked. If it is, you're losing water that should be reaching the lower pastures. That's a significant claim to make on 2 weeks of walking around." "I know it is," she said. "I'm not telling you to act on it. I'm telling you it's worth looking at." He didn't say yes. He didn't say no. He picked his coffee back up and looked out at the yard. She took that as the end of the conversation and walked back to the kitchen. 4. The first sign that something on the ranch was actively wrong, beyond the drought, beyond the water problem, came in the 3rd week. 2 of the young steers got sick overnight. By morning they were down, and by mid-morning the pattern of their symptoms was ugly in a specific way. Not random illness, not something that moved through a herd the way infections move. These 2 animals were in separate pastures. They'd both watered at the same trough near the north fence, and none of the other animals that had watered there showed symptoms. Walt looked at the trough and looked at Bridget and said, "Could be bad water, or something in the water," she said. He looked at her, then looked at the trough, then took a long time before saying, "Why would there be something in the water?" She didn't answer that directly because she didn't have enough to say anything useful yet. But she took a sample from the trough in a glass jar she'd brought from the kitchen, and she capped it and put it in her apron pocket. She brought it to Gavin Mercer that evening. He looked at the jar. He looked at her. "Where'd you get this?" "The north trough. The 2 sick steers both watered there." Walt already checked it, said it looked clear. "Clear doesn't mean clean," she said. "You can poison water, so it looks fine." The silence that followed was long enough to be uncomfortable. She held it. "That's a serious thing to say," Mercer said finally. "I know. You're suggesting someone—" "I'm not suggesting anything yet," she said. "I'm saying someone with access to a proper lab should look at this." He took the jar. He didn't look happy about it, but he took it. 2 days later, he told her quietly and without making a big thing of it that he'd had the sample looked at by the doctor in the county town, who kept a small chemical kit for testing well water. The result had not been good. There was something in the North Trough's water that shouldn't have been there. What kind of something, she said. He said it looked like it came from industrial use, chemicals used in mine processing. That's not something that gets into a trough by accident, she said. No, Gavin Mercer said. It's not. He stood there looking out the kitchen window at the yard for a long moment. Then he said, almost to himself, "Third disaster this season." She didn't push him on that, but she filed it away. She found Roy at the fence line the next afternoon. He'd been aware of her presence for about 30 seconds before he acknowledged it, which told her he'd already decided how he felt about the conversation. Water sample came back bad, she said. I heard. Third problem this season, Mercer said. I'm not talking about ranch business with the cook, Roy said. I'm not asking you to talk, she said. I'm asking you to think about something. 3 disasters, barn fire, drought that's worse than it should be, poisoned water. That's not a run of bad luck. Roy turned and looked at her directly. He was not a hostile man, she'd decided, but he was a careful one. He'd earned his position through years of steady work, and he'd built a habit of not saying more than he had to. You've been here 3 weeks, he said. I know that. 3 weeks, and you've already got opinions about the land, the water, and now the sabotage theory. It's not a theory, she said. It's a question. Is someone doing this deliberately or not? That's a real question, not an accusation. He looked at her for a long moment. The late afternoon light was cutting across the pasture behind him, catching the dust in the air. Somewhere in the distance, a cow called out, and then was quiet. There's a man, Roy said, finally. Land speculator, named Sterling Voss. He's been buying up ranches in this county for 4 or 5 years. Every one of them sold at rock-bottom prices because they were in trouble. He stopped. Was the trouble there before he bought them? She said. Roy said nothing. Was it? She said. I don't know, he said, which was not quite the same as no. But I know Mercer won't sell. He's made that clear. And I know Voss has been sniffing around the edges of this property for 2 years now. All right, she said. That's all I'm saying, Roy said, and you didn't hear it from me. She walked back toward the house. Behind her, she heard Roy go back to working the fence, the methodical sound of the post hammer in the dust. She was beginning to understand the shape of the problem. 6. The thing about Gavin Mercer was that he wasn't an easy man to read. He ran his ranch the way men of his era ran their ranches, with a certain tight efficiency, not much wasted on sentiment or explanation, the expectation that everyone understood their role and performed it without needing their hand held. He'd been widowed 6 years ago. She'd gathered that much from the hands without asking directly. His wife's name had been Clara. There was a framed photograph of her in the main room, a young woman with a steady gaze and dark hair, and Gavin never went near it if he could help it, but it was still there. He ate his meals in silence, mostly. He said thank you for the food in a tone that was genuine without being warm. He asked her once if she needed anything else from town, and when she gave him a short list, he came back with exactly what was on it and nothing extra, which she respected. He did not ask her about the land again, but she noticed he'd walked the east fence line twice in the past week. She could tell because she'd started paying attention to which way he headed after morning work. He hadn't said anything to her about it. She didn't bring it up. She was not the kind of person who needed to be the one who said the right thing first. She had patience for the long game. She'd had to develop it early in life because she'd learned early that nobody was going to hand her anything, and that the best way to earn a place was not to demand it, but to make it so obvious that you were valuable that other people came to the conclusion on their own. Cal had mostly stopped with the remarks. He'd watched her carry a 50-pound sack of grain from the wagon to the storeroom without asking for help and without visible effort, and something in his face had shifted in a way she'd noted and put aside. Walt had started saying good morning to her without being asked. Roy had not said anything more about Sterling Voss or any of it, but he watched her with a slightly different expression now, still skeptical, but attentive. She kept doing the job. She cooked well. She kept the house clean without making a production of it. She continued walking the property in the evening hours, and she kept coming back to the fence line. 7. The night of the second poisoning was the night things became impossible to ignore. Bridget woke at 2 a.m. to the sound of one of the horses in the corral making a sound she'd only heard once before in her life, a deep, rhythmic distress that was different from normal restlessness. She pulled on her boots and coat and went out. 3 of the corral horses were in trouble. The 4th was standing against the far rail, as far from the water trough as it could get, which told her what she needed to know about the trough before she even got close. She went and knocked on Roy's bunkhouse door, and when he opened it, she said, "3 horses are down. Trough's been hit again." And he looked at her face and just grabbed his coat. The next 40 minutes were the kind of ugly work she didn't think about too hard while she was doing it, trying to keep sick animals on their feet, getting fresh water from the hand pump well on the far side of the yard, walking the horses in slow circles the way you do when you're trying to keep them from going down and not getting up. Roy helped. Denny woke up on his own and came out. Walt appeared without being called, took one look, and started doing what needed doing. They kept 2 of the 3. The 3rd, a gray gelding that had been on the ranch for 8 years, was down by 3 in the morning and didn't get up. Roy crouched beside it for a long time in the dark, his hand on its neck. Nobody said anything. When he stood up, he looked at Bridget and said, "You think it's Voss's people doing this?" "I think it's someone," she said, "and I think they've been at it long enough to know how to not get caught." "That horse," Roy said. He stopped. "Mercer's had that horse since his wife was alive." She didn't say anything. "He's going to want to do something," Roy said. "When I tell him." "Tell him to wait," she said. "If we move too fast, whoever's doing this disappears, and we never prove anything. But if we're careful, if we document every incident and trace where the poison's coming from, we can bring it all down at once." Roy looked at her for a long time. The lantern between them made the shadows move. "You sound like you've done this before," he said. "I've watched people get destroyed by moving too fast when they were angry," she said. "That's not the same thing, but it's enough." He nodded, once. Slow. Across the yard, the main house light came on. A window brightened in the pre-dawn dark, and then the door opened and Gavin Mercer stood on the porch, looking at them. Bridget straightened and walked toward him across the yard. She had a lot to say. She was going to say it clearly, and she was going to say it once, and she was going to make sure he heard all of it. The gray gelding lay still in the corral behind her. The night was cold and very quiet. She walked on. Gavin Mercer stood on the porch in his coat and boots, the kind of man who dressed fast when something pulled him out of sleep, and he looked at Bridget walking toward him across the dark yard, and he already knew from the set of her shoulders that the news wasn't going to be simple. "What happened?" he said. "3 horses in the corral got into poisoned water again. We kept 2 of them." She stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at him. The gray gelding didn't make it. He was quiet for a moment. The lamplight from the window was behind him, cutting his face mostly into shadow, but she could see the way his jaw worked once, tightly, and then stopped. 8 years I had that horse," he said. "I know. Roy told me." "Roy told you a lot of things, it sounds like." "Roy told me one thing," she said. "A name. Sterling Voss." The silence that came after that was different from the other silences she'd had with this man. This one had weight to it. He looked out past her toward the corral where Roy and Walt were still moving around with the lantern, tending to the 2 survivors, and his face was doing something complicated that she didn't try to read too carefully. "Come inside," he said finally. She followed him into the kitchen. He put the lamp on the table and sat down in the chair nearest the stove, and she sat across from him without being invited, because standing felt wrong for what she needed to say. "How much do you know about Voss?" she said. "Enough," he said. "He's been acquiring land in this county for years. Every operation that went under in the last 4 or 5 years, he picked them up at distressed prices. The Callaway Spread, the twin brothers east of Harlan Creek, the Widow Pierce." He stopped. "All of them ran into trouble before they sold. Bad luck, they said." "And you never connected it." "I suspected it," he said. "But suspicion isn't proof. And Voss is careful. He doesn't do anything himself. You can't walk into a county courthouse with a suspicion and a dead horse." "No," she said. "But you can build something that holds up, if you're patient." He looked at her in the way he'd been looking at her since the barn fire, like a man still deciding whether he'd misjudged something and how much that was going to cost him. "You're the cook," he said. It came out less dismissive than it sounded, more like he was reminding himself of a fact that kept shifting on him. "I'm the cook," she agreed. And I'm telling you that whoever is doing this has been at it long enough to know your operation's weak points. The barn fire, the water, the fence line. It's not random. Someone's been watching this ranch, and they're going to keep going until you break or you sell. I'm not selling. I know that. They probably know that too. Which means they're going to keep pushing until something worse than a dead horse happens. He put his hands flat on the table. They were big, calloused hands, the kind that had spent decades in hard weather, and they were very still. What are you proposing? He said. 2 things, she said. First, I want to look at that fence line properly. The subsurface water problem I mentioned before. I think it's real, and I think it can be fixed. If we can restore the water flow to the lower pastures, the ranch stops being a dying operation. Right now, your land looks like it's failing on its own, and that's exactly what Voss wants people to believe. Fix the water, and the story changes. And second, he said, every incident from here forward gets documented. What was poisoned, when, how much, where the evidence points. And we find out where the poison is coming from. Industrial chemicals don't appear in a horse trough by magic. They come from somewhere, and somewhere means a supplier, and a supplier means a paper trail. Gavin Mercer looked at her for a long time. Outside, the wind had picked up slightly, the sound of it moving through the eave boards of the house in a low, irregular moan. You've thought this through, he said. I've been thinking about it since the first poisoning, she said. I just didn't have enough to say it clearly until tonight. He didn't answer right away. She waited. All right, he said finally. Show me the fence line in the morning. She nodded and stood up. She was halfway to the door when he said, without looking at her, that horse's name was Cutter. My wife named him. She stopped. She didn't turn around. I'm sorry, she said. Then she went out. The morning came gray and cold, a thin cloud cover sitting low over the ridgelines, and Bridget was at the east fence line by 7, with Gavin and Roy walking behind her. Walt had come along without being asked, which she'd come to understand was his way of saying he thought something was worth paying attention to. She walked them to the section she'd been studying for 3 weeks. The old fence posts sat in a line cutting diagonally across the natural drainage path of the land, their timber dark with age, the style of construction clearly older than anything else on the property. These posts, she said, they're driven deeper than survey markers need to be. 4, maybe 5 feet, if I had to guess. And the soil composition around the base of them is wrong. It's too dense, too compacted. You can see it if you know what you're looking at. She crouched and pressed her hand into the earth near the base of the nearest post, and the ground there was visibly drier, harder, almost clay-like in its texture compared to the softer soil a foot away. This is what blocking looks like. The subsurface water channel that should be feeding your lower pastures has been running into this compacted zone for decades and spreading out laterally instead of moving downhill the way it should. Roy crouched beside her and looked. He pressed his own hand into the ground. He said nothing, but she could see him thinking. So the fence killed the water, Walt said. He wasn't asking exactly. Not by itself, she said. The posts disturbed the natural drainage path when they were driven in, and over time the compaction got worse. It's been getting drier year by year, probably so slowly nobody connected it to the fence. They just saw drought. If we pull the posts, Gavin said slowly, the water comes back? I think so. I can't promise exactly how long it takes. It depends on how deep the blockage goes and whether the channel's still viable further up. But the signs up toward the ridge suggest it is. There's moisture coming down from the north face that should be reaching your pastures and isn't. Gavin stood there looking at the fence line for a long time. The wind moved through the dry grass around them with a low, papery sound. My father-in-law built this fence, he said. I know, you said. He was a hard-working man. He wasn't an engineer. He paused. He probably didn't know what he was doing when he drove those posts. Most people don't, she said. They just see a good fence line and a solid post. Roy stood up and brushed the dirt from his hands. He looked at Mercer. She might be right, he said, in the tone of a man making a significant concession. I've been on this land for 11 years, and I always assumed the water problem was the drought. But she's right that it's gotten worse at a steady rate regardless of rainfall. He paused. That's not how pure drought works. Gavin looked at Bridget. How long to pull them and see? A few days of work. If it's going to work, you'd see moisture change within a week or two. He looked at Roy. Roy shrugged, which was apparently enough. "We'll start Monday," Gavin said. The Saturday before they started on the fence line, Bridget rode out to the north boundary of the property. She'd been piecing together the geography of the ranch in her head: the creek to the east, the ridge to the north, the flat grazing land in the center, the southern approach where the road came in. The north boundary was the part she knew least, and something Roy had said about the suspicious tracks along the property line had been sitting in the back of her head since he'd said it. She found them about a mile in from the northwest gate, a stretch of soft ground near a dried creek bed where horse tracks and boot prints had pressed in and partially dried. The prints weren't fresh, maybe 4 or 5 days old, but there were several sets of them, more than one rider, and they came to a stop at the fence line and then moved along it for about 200 yards before turning back. She got down from her horse and walked the fence carefully. About halfway along the stretch the riders had paced, she found what she was looking for: a section of wire that had been cut and retwisted closed. Not carefully, but well enough that you wouldn't notice at a distance. Someone had come through here, moved along the interior of the property, and gone back out. She stood there in the cold morning with the wind pushing at her and thought about the timeline. The first horse poisoning had been 3 weeks ago. The second was 3 nights back. Someone had come through this fence at some point in between. She retwisted the wire tighter and made a note of the exact location in the way she made notes. Not on paper, which could be found and read, but in her memory, in the ordered way her father had taught her to catalog observations. North boundary, 200 yards east of the northwest gate. Cut wire. Retwisted closed. Tracks of 2 riders, approaching from the Voss side of the county line. She didn't say anything to anyone about it that day, but she started checking that section of fence every other morning on her early walks. Monday came, and their crew pulled the first fence posts. It was harder work than it sounded. The posts were old and had been in the ground for 30 years or more, and they'd settled deep into the hard pan, and getting them out without a proper post puller meant digging and leveraging and a lot of bad language from Cal, who had been assigned to the work and had clearly expected it to take an hour. "This is going to take all week," he said at noon on the first day, leaning on a shovel handle and looking at the 5 posts they'd managed to extract. "Probably," Bridget said. She'd brought the lunch out to the fence line because it was too far to walk back. Cold biscuits and ham and coffee in the canteen. Nothing fancy. "You really think this is going to fix the water?" he said. Not mocking exactly, more like genuinely asking. "I think it has a good chance," she said. "And if it doesn't? Then we're wrong. And we learned something," she said. "Either way, we know more than we did." Cal chewed his biscuit and looked at the line of holes they'd made in the earth. "My father had land," he said after a pause. "Lost it. Bad debt partly, but there was a man involved too. A speculator type, kept pushing at the edges until my father just gave up." He stopped. "Didn't know that's what it was until years later." She looked at him. He was staring out at the pasture, not at her. "What happened to your father?" she said. "Went to work for wages," Cal said. "Never had land again." He pushed off the shovel handle and went back to digging. She watched him for a moment, then picked up her own work and said nothing else about it. By Thursday, they'd pulled all but the last 4 posts in the problem section. On Friday morning, before the crew started the day, Bridget walked to the low end of the drainage path and crouched in the pasture grass. The soil was different, not dramatically, not wet, not transformed, but the density had changed. There was something moving underneath it, some slow subterranean shift, the earth beginning to remember what it was supposed to do. She pressed her palm flat against it and felt the cold coming up from below and knew that it was right. She went back to the house and made breakfast and didn't say anything to anyone. But she was smiling when she put the plates out, a small, private thing that she kept to herself. It was Denny who noticed first, 4 days after the last post came out. He came in for the midday meal with mud on his boots, unusual because the yard hadn't seen rain, and he set his hat on the rack by the door and said to no one in particular, "The far pasture's got wet ground, down near the lower fence." Walt looked up from his plate. "Wet how?" Walt said. "Wet like water's coming up from somewhere," Denny said. "Not flooding, just soft. Like it used to be in my grandfather's time," he said, "back before it got dry." The table was quiet for a moment. Roy looked at Bridget. She was at the stove with her back to the room. "Go figure," Roy said carefully. She turned around and brought the coffee pot to the table. She refilled cups and didn't say anything, but Roy was watching her face and he saw what was there before she put it away. "You knew," he said. "I hoped," she said. Gavin Mercer came in from the yard 10 minutes later and sat down, and Roy told him about the wet ground in the far pasture, and he looked at Bridget across the table and she looked back at him. "How long until it reaches the lower pastures?" he said. "Weeks," she said. "Not months. The channel's running. Just needs time." He nodded once and picked up his fork. A simple gesture, but she understood it for what it was. The crew ate in a different kind of silence than usual. Not uncomfortable. More like everyone was recalibrating something internally, adjusting to a fact they hadn't expected to have to adjust to. The letter arrived the following Tuesday. Roy brought it in from the gate and set it on the kitchen table and said to Gavin, "Came from a lawyer's office in Carver City." And his tone was the tone of a man who already doesn't like the contents of something he hasn't read. Gavin read it standing up. He read it once, then again, and then he set it on the table very deliberately and looked out the window. "What is it?" Roy said. "It's a formal complaint," Gavin said, "filed with the county land office, claiming that Blackstone Ranch is in unlawful possession of a portion of the eastern boundary, that the survey markers there are incorrect, and that I'm farming land that belongs to a neighboring interest." "Voss?" Roy said. "Not a question. His name's not on it. The filing is from a land acquisition company out of Carver City. But yes." He picked the letter up and set it down again. "This is how he starts it. He can't buy me out, so now he files legal complaints and makes me spend money and time I don't have defending a boundary that's been standing for 30 years. Bridget had been listening from the doorway between the kitchen and the hall. She stepped into the room. "Where do those eastern boundary markers sit relative to the old fence line?" she said. Gavin looked at her. "Why?" "Because if the fence line your father-in-law built was driving deeper than a standard survey marker, there might be a reason for that. Something about how the boundary was originally established." She paused. "Do you have the original survey documents for this property?" He thought about it. "In the office, in a box somewhere." "Clara?" He stopped. "My wife organized all that. I haven't gone through it in years." "I think you should go through it now," she said. He looked at her for a moment, then at Roy, then back at her. "The cook thinks I should review my legal documents," he said, not unkindly. More like a man saying something out loud to hear how it sounded. "The cook thinks someone is trying to steal your land using a legal filing," she said, "and the answer to that is in your own paperwork." Roy made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Gavin picked up the letter and walked to the back office. She went back to the kitchen and started on supper. Through the wall, after a while, she could hear the sound of a box being moved and papers being shifted, and Gavin Mercer going through 30 years of his family's history, looking for something that might help him hold on to it. The water was coming back to the land, but something darker was coming with it, and she could feel the shape of it now, the way you feel a storm before the sky shows any evidence of one, something in the pressure, something in the way everything goes a little too quiet. She kept her head down and her eyes open, and she kept cooking, because that was what held the day together, and the day had to hold together before anything else could. Gavin found what he was looking for on the second evening. Bridget was washing the supper dishes when she heard him come through the hall, and something in the weight of his footsteps was different, not urgent, not panicked, but deliberate in the way that meant he'd found something and was deciding what to do with it. He came into the kitchen and set a folded document on the table beside her. "Original survey," he said. "Filed 1848. The eastern boundary runs 22 feet west of where Voss's lawyers are claiming it runs." She dried her hands and looked at the document. The paper was brittle at the folds. The ink faded to brown, but the lines were clear enough. The surveyor's marks, the boundary descriptions, the witness signatures at the bottom. "This is what they're contesting," she said. "They're claiming the original survey was in error and that a corrected survey was filed in 1869. He set a second document beside the first. "This one." She looked at both of them side by side. The 1869 document had the same formatting as the original, but the boundary markers had shifted. Not dramatically, a few dozen feet in one section, a couple hundred in another, but consistently, and always in the same direction. Always pushing Blackstone's legal boundary westward. "Who filed the 1869 correction," she said. "A man named Albrecht, land surveyor from Carver City." He paused. I looked him up in the county records. Albrecht's survey company dissolved in 1871. He died in 1874. Convenient, she said. Very. He sat down at the table. He looked tired, not the tired of a bad night's sleep, but the tired of a man who'd spent 2 years not wanting to believe something and was now being made to believe it, whether he wanted to or not. The 1869 document only exists in the county land office as a copy. The original was apparently lost. Lost copies can be made, she said. Yes, they can. He looked at the 2 documents. I need a lawyer who knows land law. There's one in Harlan, but he's expensive and I don't know whose pocket he's in. There's a federal land office in Carver City, she said. Federal, not county. If Voss has people in the county system, the county records can be manipulated, but a federal filing is harder to touch. He looked at her. How do you know about the federal land office in Carver City? I passed through Carver City 2 years ago. There was a dispute over a mining claim while I was there. The federal office was the only place the smaller party had any leverage. She folded her hands on the table. This boundary dispute is your opening. You file a challenge with the federal land office. You put the 1848 original on record federally, and suddenly Voss can't just manipulate a county clerk to make the problem go away. Gavin was quiet for a moment. You think this big, he said. I think practically, she said. There's a difference. He looked at the documents again. Outside the kitchen window, the night was fully dark, and the wind had died to almost nothing. Somewhere across the yard, one of the surviving horses made a sound, and then was quiet. I'll ride to Carver City Thursday, he said. She nodded and picked her dish towel back up and went back to the sink. Behind her, she heard him gather the documents carefully, handling the old paper with more gentleness than she would have expected from him, and then his footsteps going back down the hall. Yeet. Sterling Voss responded to the federal filing faster than anyone anticipated. Gavin had been back from Carver City for 4 days when the first direct threat arrived. Not a letter this time. A man. He came up the road in the early afternoon on a good horse, well-dressed in the way that frontier money dressed, not flashy, but everything quality, the kind of outfit that said the wearer had choices. He stopped at the main gate and asked for Mercer, and Roy sent word to the house, and Gavin came out to the yard to meet him. Bridget watched from the kitchen window. She couldn't hear what was being said, but she could read the body language well enough. The man did most of the talking. Gavin stood with his arms at his sides in the particular stillness he used when he was angry and controlling it. At one point, the man said something that made Gavin's shoulders lift slightly, and the man smiled, which was the wrong response to whatever Gavin said back. The conversation lasted about 8 minutes. Then the man turned his horse and rode back out the gate. Roy came into the kitchen 20 minutes later. Name was Hollins, he said, Voss's man. Said Voss is prepared to offer Mercer a fair price for the ranch, given the ongoing difficulties. Said if the difficulties continue, the offer would be less fair. He said that plainly? Bridget said. Plain enough that Mercer understood it. Roy poured himself coffee. Mercer told him to get off the property and not come back. Good, she said. Maybe, Roy said, and the way he said it carried a weight she understood. Good intentions and a federal filing didn't stop hired men with torches. She'd been building her evidence file for 3 weeks by this point. A systematic record of every incident, dates, locations, physical evidence, the sample from the north trough, the cut wire on the north boundary, the approximate timing that connected the intrusions to the incidents that followed. She'd been doing it in a notebook she kept in the bottom of her kitchen supply trunk where nobody would think to look. She wasn't sure yet what she was building toward, but she knew that the shape of it mattered, that a collection of connected incidents pointed somewhere very different than a run of bad luck. The night after Hollins's visit, she checked the north boundary fence at her usual time and found the wire cut again, freshly, within the last day or two. Same location as before, same method. She retwisted it and marked the date and stood in the cold dark for a moment thinking about what was coming, because something was coming. She could feel it the way the land probably felt water moving back through it. Not visibly yet, not dramatically, but underneath everything, the pressure building. She told Gavin about the fence that evening after supper, when the crew had cleared out and it was just the 2 of them at the kitchen table with the lamp between them. He listened without interrupting, which she'd come to recognize as the way he handled information he found significant. The lesser things, he'd cut in. The things that mattered, he let run out. 2 cuts in the same location, he said when she finished. Same method. Someone who knows what they're doing, not someone who's in a hurry or acting random. She slid the notebook across the table. This is everything I've been tracking. Every incident, every piece of evidence I could collect. The troughs, the wire, Hollins's visit, the timing. He opened the notebook and looked at the first page, then the second. He took longer on the third page, where she'd laid out the timeline showing the gap between the fence intrusions and the subsequent poisonings. You've been doing this for 3 weeks, he said, since the first night with the horses. He kept reading. She let him. The lamp made a small sound, the wick needed trimming, and she got up and trimmed it without making a fuss about it and sat back down. This is good work, he said, and there was something in his voice that he hadn't put there before. Not quite surprise anymore. Something past surprise. It's not complete, she said. I know where the poison is coming from, the industrial chemicals, the specific type, but I don't have the supply chain yet. Who bought it? Who handled it? That's the piece that connects Voss's operation to what's happening on this property. How do you get that? Carefully, she said. There's a supply merchant in Tulliver, 40 miles east. He handles chemical supplies to the mine operations in the basin. If someone bought the type of chemical that showed up in your troughs, it went through him or someone who bought from him. I need to find out if there's a purchase record. That's a long ride, he said. I know. And if Voss has people watching who goes where, then I go in a way that doesn't look like what it is, she said. I'm the cook. I need kitchen supplies. People don't pay attention to cooks on supply runs. He looked at her for a long moment in the lamplight. She'd gotten used to that look by now. The recalibration, the ongoing adjustment to the fact of her. She didn't mind it. People saw what they expected to see, and then reality wore them down eventually. Saturday, he said. I'll tell Roy you need the supply wagon. One more thing, she said. The original survey documents, the 1848 one. Keep it somewhere safe, somewhere off this property, not in the house. He understood why without her having to say it. Arson was the oldest solution in the speculator's playbook. My sister in Harlan, he said. I'll get it to her this week. She nodded and closed the notebook. The supply run to Tulliver took most of Saturday. She drove the wagon herself, a skill she'd had since her teens, and she took Denny along because he was the least likely of the crew to read anything into what she was doing and the most likely to talk to strangers naturally without making it look like anything. Tulliver was a wide street supply town built around the needs of the basin mines. Hardware merchants, a feedlot, a freight office, 3 competing general stores, and on the eastern end of the main street, a chemical supply depot operated by a man named Casper Greel, who was approximately 60 years old and so thoroughly accustomed to selling dangerous substances to mine operations that he'd developed the professional affect of a man who did not think about what the things he sold were used for. Bridget bought kitchen supplies at the general store first. She had a real list, which helped. And then, while Denny loaded the wagon, she walked to the chemical supply depot and went in. Greel was behind the counter doing inventory. She told him she worked for a ranch that was having issues with a specific type of weed infestation, and she'd heard that some mine operations used a particular type of chemical preparation that was effective. She described the chemical, the type that had been found in the troughs, in terms general enough to sound like hearsay, but specific enough to tell her whether he recognized it. He recognized it. That's not a weed treatment, he said, looking at her over the counter. I know, she said. I'm told it's also effective for a different purpose that I'd rather not name. He looked at her for a moment. She'd dressed plain for this trip, traveling clothes, nothing remarkable. I don't sell that to individuals, he said, only to registered operations. I understand, she said. I was just wondering if there's much call for it. Seems unusual for this part of the basin. There was an order, he said slowly, about 4 months back, fairly large, more than a mine would use in a season. He seemed to be deciding how much to say. It was a corporate purchase, an acquisition company out of Carver City. She kept her face neutral. Was it a new customer? First order, he said. Paid in full. Cash. The company name, Greel's Supply doesn't discuss customer accounts, he said, and that was the end of it. But she had what she needed. 4 months ago, roughly when the incidents at Blackstone had started. A Carver City acquisition company, cash purchase, large volume. She thanked him and left. On the ride back, Denny talked about his family's place in Missouri, and she listened and said appropriate things while her mind was running the pieces together, adding the Tulliver information to the notebook entries and the timeline, building the shape of a thing that was becoming harder and harder to call coincidence. She got back to the ranch at dusk and found something wrong from 100 yards out. The yard was too quiet, and the lights were wrong. The bunkhouse window was dark at a time it shouldn't have been, and the main house door was standing open. She pulled the wagon up and set the brake, and Denny said, "Huh," in a low voice, and they both got down carefully. Walt met them coming from the direction of the barn, moving fast. "Somebody hit the south pasture fence," he said. "Cut it in 3 places. About a dozen head got through and scattered into the creek bed. Roy and Mercer are out there now." He paused. "That's not the worst of it." "What's the worst of it?" Bridget said. "Someone was in the house," Walt said. "Went through the office. Mercer's papers are all over the floor." She was moving before he finished the sentence. The office was a small room off the back hall, and it looked like a deliberate mess. Drawers pulled, papers scattered, a box knocked from the shelf, and its contents spread across the floor. But deliberate mess had a pattern to it. Whoever had been through here was looking for something specific, and she could tell from the way the search had concentrated on the document storage that they were looking for papers. The 1848 survey. Gavin had said he'd get it to his sister in Harlan. She didn't know if he'd done it yet. She went to the kitchen, to the drawer where she'd seen him put things of temporary importance, and it wasn't there. She checked the bedroom door. Not her place to go in, but she knocked and pushed it open an inch and called, and there was no one there. Then she went to the front room and looked at the mantel where the photograph of Clara sat. And behind the photograph, she'd noticed weeks ago that there was a slight gap between the picture frame and the wall. The photograph was slightly forward of where it usually sat. She didn't touch it. If the survey was behind it, whoever had searched the office hadn't thought to look there, which meant either it was there and they'd missed it, or it was already gone to Harlan. Either way, it wasn't her place to look. She stepped back. Gavin came in from the yard 40 minutes later, muddy from the creek bed, with Roy behind him. He looked at the office doorway and then at Bridget. "They find anything," he said. "I don't think so," she said. "The survey already in Harlan," he said. 2 days ago." He looked at the scattered papers without going into the office. "They'll know they didn't get what they came for." "Which means they'll come back," Roy said. "Or they'll stop looking for paper and start doing something more direct," Gavin said. He said it flatly, without visible fear, but with the complete absence of comfort that people sometimes perform when they want to seem unafraid. This was real. He was calculating odds. Roy looked at Bridget. She looked back at him. "We should talk about watches," Roy said to Gavin. "Someone on the perimeter at night, starting tonight." "Agreed," Gavin said. "I'll take the north boundary," Bridget said. Both men looked at her. "You're the cook," Roy said, and this time it was different from all the other times it had been said to her. It was protective rather than dismissive, and she understood that, but she also wasn't having it. "I know the north boundary better than anyone on this crew," she said. "I've been walking it for 6 weeks. I know where the cut wire is. I know the approach lines. I know what sounds wrong out there." She paused. "You need Walt and Denny covering the south and east because that's where the cattle are. Roy, you should be at the main gate. That leaves the north." The logic was plain enough that neither of them argued it. Roy turned to Gavin, who was looking at Bridget with an expression that had moved past recalibration into something she didn't have a clean word for. "Fine," Gavin said, "but you take the rifle from the rack." "I was going to," she said. The night watch started that evening and ran 4 nights without incident, which was the most dangerous kind of quiet, the kind that made people wonder if they'd overreacted, if they'd misread things, if maybe it was going to be all right after all. On the 5th night, the barn went up. Not the main barn, that one was still partially rebuilt from the first fire. This was the equipment shed on the northwest corner of the property, a long, low building that housed the wagons and the heavier tools and some of the winter feed supply. Bridget saw the glow from the north boundary at approximately 2 in the morning, and she ran. By the time she reached the shed, it was fully involved on the east wall, the same pattern as the first barn fire, she registered, even in the middle of running. Started at one end and running toward the other. She didn't go in. There were no animals in the equipment shed, and she wasn't going to die for machinery. She stood at the edge of the heat and let it be what it was, and shouted toward the bunkhouse until lights came on. The crew came out. They fought it with water and dirt and managed to keep it from spreading to the stack of winter feed at the far end, which would have been catastrophic going into the cold months. The shed itself was a total loss. In the dirt at the northwest corner, in the soft ground near where the fire had started, she found a boot print she didn't recognize. Too large for any of the regular crew, with a distinctive notch on the inner heel. She covered it with her coat before the crew moved through that area, and when things were calm enough, she borrowed Roy's field lantern and traced the print carefully, pressing a flat piece of board into the dirt beside it to preserve the shape as long as possible. She also found, 20 feet from the burn site, a small metal container with a burn hole in the lid. She picked it up with a cloth and put it in her coat pocket. The container had originally held something that accelerated fire, and on the bottom, stamped faintly into the metal, was a manufacturer's mark. She'd seen that mark before, on a freight manifest pinned to the wall in Greel's supply depot. The circle was closing. She stood in the pre-dawn yard with the charred remains of the equipment shed still smoking in front of her, and the metal container in her pocket, and she thought about the name on that freight manifest, and she thought about the Carver City Acquisition Company, and she thought about what a federal investigator would need to take that chain from suspicion to evidence. Gavin came to stand beside her. He looked at the shed. He looked at her. "You found something," he said. He'd gotten to where he could read her silences. "Yes," she said. "Tell me." "Not yet," she said. "I need one more piece." He looked at her for a long moment in the dark, ash still drifting down from somewhere above them, the sky starting to go the particular deep blue of very early morning. "I trust you," he said. It came out without ceremony, the way the most real things usually do, not built up to, not decorated, just placed in the air between them like something he'd been carrying and decided to set down. She looked at him. He wasn't looking at her anymore. He was looking at the shed. "I know," she said. She walked back toward the house, the metal container a solid weight in her pocket, her mind already working through the next steps, the last pieces, the particular shape of what had to happen now for any of this to end in justice, rather than just more fire. The sky was lightening in the east, gray-blue and cold, and Blackstone Ranch smelled of smoke and wet earth, and underneath it all, if you knew where to stand, the faint clear smell of water finding its way back through the land. The one more piece she needed was a name. She had the container with the manufacturer's mark. She had the timeline connecting Greel's supply depot to the Carver City Acquisition Company. She had the notebook with 6 weeks of documented incidents, the cut wire, the trough samples, the boot print preserved as best she could on the board. What she didn't have was the human link, the name of the person at the acquisition company who had authorized those purchases, who had hired Hollins, who had sent men through the north boundary fence. She needed someone in Voss's operation who could be connected, on paper, to what had been done to Blackstone Ranch. She spent 2 days thinking about it before she found the angle. The freight manifests at Greel's depot were the key. Greel himself wouldn't talk, she'd established that. But freight manifests were business records, and business records in a supply operation that dealt with registered mining companies were subject to federal review. She knew this because her father had dealt with exactly that situation once, a mining company dispute involving supply fraud, and the federal land office in that case had subpoenaed the supplier's records as part of their investigation. The federal land office in Carver City was already holding Gavin's boundary challenge. She needed to give them a reason to look further. She wrote the letter on a Tuesday night at the kitchen table after everyone had gone to sleep. She was not a formal writer. She'd had basic schooling and then learned the rest from her father's engineering documents and from years of reading whatever she could find in whatever place she happened to be. But she was precise. She laid out what she had in plain language: the incidents, the dates, the evidence, the chemical supply connection, the timing that placed a large purchase of accelerant chemicals 4 months before the first fire, the boundary dispute filing by a Carver City Acquisition Company against a ranch that had subsequently suffered arson twice. She did not claim more than she could support. She let the facts sit beside each other and make their own argument. She addressed it to the federal land office and to the regional office of the Federal Marshal Service, because federal land fraud was a matter for both. She sealed it and put it in her coat pocket. In the morning, she told Gavin she needed to ride to the post office in Harlan. He looked at her across the breakfast table. The crew had mostly finished eating and were heading out, and the kitchen was going quiet. "For what?" he said, Letters, she said. 2 of them. To federal offices in Carver City. He was quiet for a moment. You're going above the county system. The county system is how the 1869 survey document appeared, she said. I'm not going anywhere near the county system. He looked at his coffee cup and then back at her. What's in the letters? Everything in the notebook, she said, organized so that someone with authority to act on it can see the pattern clearly. And you think they will? I think federal investigators respond to evidence of fraud involving land acquisition across multiple properties, she said. Roy told me the ranches that Voss took over, Callaway, the brothers east of Harlan Creek, the widow Pierce. If those operations suffered the same kind of incidents before they sold, that's a pattern that reaches well beyond Blackstone. A federal office has reason to care about that. Gavin was quiet again. Through the kitchen window, the morning light was white and flat, the kind of light that came before weather changed. You've been planning this for a while, he said. Since the equipment shed fire, she said. I needed the container from that night to connect the chemical supply to the physical evidence. That was the last piece. He set his coffee cup down. He looked at her with the same expression he'd had standing in the pre-dawn yard the night of the fire, when he'd said, I trust you, without building up to it. Go to Harlan, he said. Take Denny. She nodded and stood up. Bridget, he said. She stopped. Be careful what roads you take coming back. She understood what he meant. If Voss had people watching the ranch and watching who came and went, a trip to Harlan on the same week as a federal filing landing in Carver City was a connection she'd rather not have anyone make. I'll come back through the Kellner Valley Road, she said. Longer, but it doesn't pass through the county seat. He nodded once and went back to his coffee. The letters went out on a Wednesday. For 10 days after that, nothing happened. The watch rotation continued on the property. The lower pastures were visibly greener now. Nothing dramatic, no sudden transformation, but the grass coming back in thin, persistent lines where the soil had been dry for years. The cattle drifting toward those sections on their own, the way cattle do when the land is giving them something they need. Roy pointed it out to Gavin one morning without saying Bridget's name, just gesturing out at the lower pasture and saying, water's moving through. And Gavin had looked for a long moment and said nothing, which was enough. On the 11th day, 2 men arrived at the ranch that nobody had invited. They came in the early afternoon on good horses, both wearing trail coats, and they asked at the gate for Gavin Mercer by name. Roy came to find Bridget in the kitchen before he went to tell Gavin. 2 men at the gate, he said. They showed a federal identification to Shep, Land Office and Marshal Service, they said. She had her apron off before he finished. The 2 federal men were named Adler and Crane. Adler was from the Federal Land Office. A compact, precise man in his late 40s who spoke in the clipped manner of someone who had given testimony before and was always half prepared to do so again. Crane was a deputy federal marshal, younger, quieter, with the particular kind of stillness that she associated with men who had learned to read rooms fast and stay in the background until they decided not to be. Gavin brought them into the front room. Roy stood near the door. Bridget brought coffee, and Adler glanced at her in the automatic way people glance at the person who brings the coffee, and then looked again, not at her, but at the notebook she'd set on the table beside the coffee tray. Is that the documentation referenced in the letter? He said. Yes, she said. Gavin looked at her. She looked at him. He made a small gesture, go ahead, and she sat down at the table across from the 2 federal men. The letter came from you, Adler said. It wasn't quite a question. Yes, she said again. Crane had not touched his coffee. He was looking at her with a professional blankness that she'd seen before in people who were good at their jobs and weren't going to show their reactions until they'd heard everything. She walked them through the notebook. She did it methodically, the way her father had taught her to present technical information. Start with what you know for certain, separate it clearly from what you're inferring, and let the audience draw their own conclusions from the gap between the two. She showed them the timeline, the chemical supply information, the container with the manufacturer's mark, the cut wire documentation, the survey documents. Adler took notes throughout. Crane did not, but she noticed he remembered everything. Twice he asked her to go back to a specific date, and his recall of the details she'd mentioned 3 pages earlier was exact. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. The Carver City Acquisition Company, Adler said. You have the name from the freight manifest? The name on the manifest is Voss Land and Property Holdings, she said, registered in Carver City. Sterling Voss is listed as the principal officer in the county business registry. Adler wrote something down. You mentioned other ranches, Crane said. It was the first time he'd spoken directly to her. His voice was even and unhurried. The Callaway property, the brothers east of Harlan Creek. Do you have documentation on those? Not directly, she said. I have Roy Sutter's account of the pattern. He's the foreman here, and he's been in this county for 11 years. He can describe what he observed at those properties before they sold. The sales records would be in the county land office, but I'd suggest the original documents rather than the copies. Crane looked at her steadily. Why? Because the 1869 survey copy that appeared in the county land office to contest this ranch's boundary was manufactured, she said. If someone can introduce false documents into the county system once, they can do it elsewhere. The original records, if they still exist, would be more reliable. Crane wrote nothing down, but his expression shifted by approximately 1 degree in a direction she couldn't name exactly. Respect, maybe. Or something cooler than respect. Professional recognition. The chemical container, Adler said. Where is it now? She produced it from the interior pocket of her coat. She'd been carrying it for 11 days, which was perhaps excessive, but she'd felt better having it on her person than locked in a trunk at a ranch that had already been broken into once. She set it on the table. Crane picked it up with a cloth from his coat pocket, which told her he'd been expecting physical evidence and had come prepared for it. He turned it over and looked at the manufacturer's mark on the bottom. This is from Greel's Depot in Tulliver, he said. Yes, she said. You got that from Greel? From the freight manifest posted on the wall in his public area, she said. I didn't take anything from his premises. Crane set the container down. Something in the way he'd said Greel's Depot suggested he already knew the name, which meant the federal offices had already been looking somewhere in this direction before her letter arrived. She didn't say that out loud. She filed it. Mr. Mercer, Adler said, turning to Gavin, the original 1848 survey document you mentioned in the letter, is it in your possession? It's with my sister in Harlan, Gavin said. I can have it here within 2 days. We'd rather take custody of it directly, Crane said, if you're willing to provide your sister's address. Gavin looked at Bridget. She gave a small nod. He wrote the address on a slip of paper and handed it to Crane. What happens now? Gavin said. Adler gathered his notes. We open a formal inquiry into the land acquisition activity of Voss Land and Property Holdings in this county and the 2 adjacent counties where we've had preliminary reports of similar patterns. He paused. This is not a quick process. I want to be clear about that. A formal federal inquiry takes time. You should expect continued pressure on this property in the interim. Voss will know an inquiry has been opened because our office is required to notify parties under investigation. But he gets... Well, when he finds out, Roy said from near the door, he might push harder before you get to him. That's possible, Adler said, with the honesty of a man who had seen it before and wasn't going to pretend otherwise. Which is why I'd recommend keeping your watch rotation in place and documenting any further incidents immediately. Crane stood and picked up the chemical container and its cloth. He looked at Bridget. The notebook. We need to retain it as part of the inquiry file. She'd expected that. She'd spent 2 nights last week making a complete copy of every entry from memory, which was not as precise as the original, but was close enough for her purposes. She slid the notebook across the table to him. There's one thing I want to ask, she said. Crane stopped. The ranches that already sold to Voss, she said. Callaway, the others. If the inquiry finds that those sales resulted from fraud and criminal coercion, is there a mechanism for those families to recover their land? Adler and Crane looked at each other briefly. That depends on the findings and whether the sales can be voided under fraud law, Adler said. It's not impossible, but it would require a separate legal process and willing cooperation from... I understand, she said. I'm not asking you to promise it. I'm asking if the door's open. The door's open, Crane said. And then he picked up his hat and walked out. The notification went to Voss 6 days later. Gavin told Bridget about it at supper, in the same quiet tone he used for information that was both significant and dangerous. Roy heard from a man he knows in Carver City, he said. Voss received the federal inquiry notice day before yesterday. Word is he's not taking it quietly. What's he doing? She said. Hiring more lawyers, Gavin said, and possibly other things. The man Roy knows wasn't specific. The crew was at the table. The room was quiet enough that everyone heard this exchange, and the quality of the quiet afterward was the particular kind that came from 7 people all adjusting privately to new information. Cal said, after a moment, "So he knows we went federal." "Yes," Gavin said. "And he knows—" Cal stopped and looked at Bridget. "He knows it was documented from here, that someone here put the file together." "He'll know that from the inquiry notice," she said. Cal looked at her for a moment. He was 22 years old and had not done anything in his 3 months on this ranch that was remarkable, but the expression on his face right now was not the face of a careless young man. "You're not worried," he said. "I'm careful," she said. "That's not the same thing as not worried." Roy was looking at his plate. "If he sends men, real men, not the sneaky fence type, then we deal with it," Walt said. It was the most words Walt had said at the dinner table in 6 weeks, and the bluntness of it settled something in the room. Nobody said much else. She refilled the water glasses and sat back down, and they finished the meal. The night the men came, it was raining. Not hard. A thin, cold drizzle that had started around midnight and made the darkness thicker, and the sound of it on the roof cover smaller noises. Bridget was at the north boundary when she heard the horses. Not one this time. At least 3. She didn't run. She moved fast, but she moved quietly, keeping to the tree line, back toward the main yard, and she fired 1 shot into the air, the agreed signal, when she was close enough that the sound would carry to the bunkhouse without carrying too far beyond the ridge. By the time she reached the yard, Roy and Walt were already out. Cal was right behind them. The 3 riders had come in through the south gate, not the north, which meant they'd either known she was watching the north boundary or they'd split their approach. And she immediately turned and checked behind her, and there was no one coming from the north, which meant they'd gone south deliberately. What they'd come to do wasn't immediately clear in the dark and the rain. One of them had a torch, already lit, which told her it was arson again. They weren't here for a conversation. Roy put himself between the torch and the nearest outbuilding and said something in a hard voice that Bridget couldn't make out at distance. And the rider with the torch pulled his horse up short. There was a standoff of about 45 seconds that felt much longer. Then Gavin came out of the main house with the rifle he'd offered Bridget weeks ago. She had her own by now. And he walked into the yard and he looked at the 3 riders and said, in a voice that carried clearly through the rain, "The Federal Marshal Service has an open inquiry on the man who hired you. You are committing crimes on a property under federal documentation. I would think carefully about what you do next." It was not a perfect speech. It was not a clean moment. One of the riders' horses was dancing sideways, and Gavin's hair was plastered flat in the rain, and Roy was shaking slightly. From cold or adrenaline, she couldn't tell. And she was standing at the edge of the yard with her rifle up, and her pulse loud in her ears. But the rider with the torch looked at the lit end of it for a moment, like he was calculating something, and then he let it drop into the mud where it went out with a small, wet sound. They turned and went back out the south gate. The yard was quiet except for the rain. Cal said, "That's it?" in a voice that wasn't quite steady. "That's it for tonight," Roy said. Gavin lowered the rifle and stood in the rain and looked at the south gate for a long moment. Then he turned and walked back to the house without saying anything. Bridget watched him go. At the door he stopped and looked back at her, just for a second, just long enough, and then went inside. She stayed in the yard a while after the others went back to bed. The rain kept coming down, cold and thin, and the mud where the torch had gone out was just dark mud, indistinguishable from the rest of the yard. What she was feeling was not relief exactly. Relief came when something ended. This hadn't ended, but the shape of it had changed. It had moved from something hidden and accumulating in the dark to something that had been forced into the open, and things in the open were harder to sustain. Voss's men had come and gone and achieved nothing, and they would report that back. And Voss would have to decide what that meant for an operation that was now being examined by federal investigators. Momentum was a real thing. She'd learned that from watching her father work through difficult problems. The moment a problem started moving toward a resolution rather than away from one, everything shifted. She walked back to the house. In the kitchen, she built up the stove and set water to heat and sat at the table in the dark for a while, not thinking about anything in particular, just sitting with it. The sound of the rain on the roof, the creak of the house settling in the cold, the faint smell of wood smoke from the stove starting to work. She thought about the Calloway family and the brothers east of Harlan Creek and the widow Pierce, and she thought about whether Crane had been telling her the truth when he said the door was open. She thought about her father, the way he'd laid out problems on survey paper, every line meaning something, nothing arbitrary, the shape of the truth visible if you were patient enough to draw it out. She thought about Gavin Mercer standing in the rain with his rifle and his flat hair and his voice cutting through the yard without a tremor in it, and she thought that people surprised you sometimes. That was the human thing about it. You made your assessment and then reality added a detail and you had to adjust. And the adjustment was the actual substance of knowing someone. The water heated. She made tea, not coffee, it was too late for coffee, and drank it slowly at the kitchen table while the rain continued and Blackstone Ranch held together around her. Voss's arrest came 3 weeks later. It came on a Tuesday, which seemed like the wrong day for something that size, but that was how such things went. Not on dramatic evenings with appropriate weather, but on ordinary weekdays when the light was flat and the cattle still needed feeding. Crane rode out personally to inform Gavin, which she thought was a small but deliberate courtesy, and he told them that Voss and 2 of his business partners had been taken into federal custody on charges including land fraud, arson, criminal conspiracy, and the deliberate poisoning of livestock, the last of which carried its own federal weight under statutes protecting agricultural operations. The supply chain had held up. Greel's records, subpoenaed, had connected the chemical purchase to Voss's company directly. The boot print from the equipment shed fire had matched a man in Voss's employ. And the pattern across 3 counties, Calloway, the Harlan Creek brothers, the widow Pierce, and 2 other operations Bridget hadn't known about, had been extensive enough that the federal inquiry had expanded to include investigators from 2 adjacent districts. Crane had stood in the yard delivering all this in his unhurried way, and at the end of it he'd looked at Bridget. She was standing near the porch, having come out of the kitchen when she'd heard the horse, and said, "The documentation in that notebook was the clearest evidentiary record we received from any of the affected properties. I wanted you to know that." She nodded once. "The door you asked about," he said. "For the other families. Our office will be contacting them." He tipped his hat, at her specifically, not at Gavin, and rode back out the main gate. Roy let out a long breath from somewhere behind her. Denny said something under his breath that sounded like disbelief. Walt said nothing. Cal walked up and stood beside her and looked at the gate where Crane had ridden out and said, after a moment, "You did that." "We did it," she said. "You helped pull those fence posts." "I complained the whole time," he said. "Yes," she said. "But you kept digging." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. Not quite. Gavin was standing at the edge of the porch. She could feel him there without looking directly at him. That had been happening more, a kind of peripheral awareness she'd stopped trying to explain to herself. She looked over. He was looking at her. "Come have coffee," he said. It was addressed generally, to the whole yard, but it wasn't quite general. She went up the porch steps and went inside, and behind her she heard the crew following, the sound of boots on the boards, and the door of the house that had been running wrong for so long closing firmly behind them all. The coffee that morning was the best she'd ever made at Blackstone, and she couldn't explain why. Same beans, same water, same stove. But sometimes things tasted different when the weight pressing on them had been lifted, and she understood that wasn't about the coffee at all. The crew crowded into the kitchen in a way they never had before, not in the organized, functional way of men coming to eat and leaving, but the loose, uncertain way of people who didn't know quite what to do with good news and were figuring it out in real time. Roy sat at the table and didn't say much, but kept his hands wrapped around his cup. Denny talked too much and too fast, the way he did when he was relieved. Cal stood against the wall with his arms crossed and looked at the floor and occasionally at Bridget, working through something internal he hadn't gotten to the end of yet. Walt drank his coffee by the window and watched the yard, and she thought that was probably just who Walt was, a man who felt better knowing what was outside. Gavin sat at the head of the table and let the noise run. He was not a man who showed relief in obvious ways, but the lines around his eyes were different. Something in his face had come down a few degrees from where it had been sitting for as long as she'd known him. At some point, the conversation turned to what came next. The practical things, the destroyed equipment shed needed rebuilding before winter. The south pasture fence needed full replacement. The herd inventory needed to be assessed against what Voss's harassment had cost them. Roy started making a mental list out loud, and Gavin responded to each item in order. And the conversation became the kind of conversation that working ranches have when they're moving forward rather than just trying to hold position. It sounded different. She noticed the difference. She refilled cups and didn't say much, which was fine. She was good at being in a room without needing to be the center of it. Her father had been the same way, present and useful, and not requiring recognition for either. It was Cal who finally said what she suspected a few of them had been thinking. He looked up from the floor and looked at her and said, "I said some things when you first came here." "You said a lot of things," she said. "Yeah." He paused. "They were wrong. Some of them," she said. He looked at her. "Which ones weren't?" "The biscuits. First batch was a little dry. I'd been using that stove wrong." She kept a straight face for approximately 2 seconds before something cracked slightly at the corner of her mouth, and Cal made a sound that started as a laugh and finished as something more complicated. Roy shook his head at his coffee cup. Walt made a noise from the window. Denny laughed openly, the way Denny did everything, without restraint or embarrassment. Gavin was looking at her across the table with an expression she had no clean category for, and she met it for a moment and then went to the stove. Cold. The weeks after Voss's arrest moved differently than the weeks before. Not easier. There was too much work for easy. The equipment shed rebuilding started the following Monday and ate 2 weeks of the crew's time alongside regular operations. The federal inquiry generated paperwork that Gavin had to respond to, which meant evenings at the desk in the back office going through documents and writing formal responses in his careful, deliberate handwriting. The South Pasture fence, 3 sections of it compromised by Voss's men over the course of their campaign, took another week to properly assess and repair. But the quality of this work was different. It was building rather than defending. That distinction mattered more than it might sound. The water continued its slow return. By the 5th week after the fence posts had come out, the lower pastures had changed visibly. Not lush, nothing dramatic or unearned, but genuinely better. Grass filling in where the ground had been bare and cracked. The cattle ranging further into the lower sections on their own, which was the truest indicator, because cattle don't move toward something that isn't worth moving toward. Roy walked the lower boundary one morning and came back and reported to Gavin without editorializing, and Gavin walked it himself that afternoon. And when he came back, he went to find Bridget in the kitchen. "The far end is coming back," he said. "I know," she said. "I walked it this morning." He leaned against the door frame. It was late afternoon, the kitchen warm from supper prep, the light coming in at the low angle it took in the fall. "My father-in-law built that fence in good faith," he said. "He didn't know what it was doing." "Most damage isn't done with bad intentions," she said. "It's done with incomplete information." He considered that. "My wife used to say something like that. Different words." She kept her hands moving on what she was doing, dicing carrots, a mundane and grounding thing, and let that sit without pushing on it. Clara had been in the house this whole time, in the photograph on the mantel, in the particular silence Gavin carried in the rooms she'd lived in. Bridget had never tried to crowd that. She wasn't built for crowding things that deserved space. "She would have liked you," Gavin said. It came out quietly, the way things came out of him when they were real. She stopped cutting. "You don't have to say that," she said. "I know I don't," he said. "I said it because it's true." She looked at him. He was still in the doorframe, not quite in the kitchen, the way he positioned himself sometimes when he wanted to say something and hadn't committed yet to fully entering the room to say it. She was practical, he said. Not cold, just she saw things the way they were. She didn't need them to be something else to feel all right. He paused. Not many people are like that. Bridget set the knife down and turned to face him properly. "I'm sorry you lost her," she said. 6 years ago, he said. "It doesn't get smaller, you just get bigger around it, I think. More room for it to sit without taking everything." She thought that was one of the truest things she'd heard a person say about grief. That it didn't diminish, that you just grew the capacity to carry it. She'd had her own losses, her father, 3 years back. The particular loneliness of a life spent moving between places, belonging nowhere completely. She understood the mechanism of it. "You've been here 4 months, he said. "Almost 5, she said. "Almost 5. He looked at her directly. "I don't know how this place would have come through it without you. I've been trying to find a way to say that doesn't sound like something you'd brush off." "I'd brush it off regardless," she said. "I know." He almost smiled. "So I'll say it plainly. You saved this ranch. Not by yourself. Roy and the crew worked hard, and the investigators did what needed doing. But you were the one who saw it clearly when nobody else did, and you held it together when it could have come apart. He stopped. That's not nothing. That's the whole thing. She looked at him and felt something she didn't have a practiced response for. She'd spent most of her adult life in situations where her value was functional. What she could do, what she could carry, how much she could manage on limited resources. People appreciated her in the way they appreciated a tool that worked well. This was different. This was someone looking at her as a person and saying, "You mattered here, and I saw it. You trusted me," she said. That wasn't nothing either. Most people wouldn't have. Most people would have been wrong, he said. The kitchen was quiet except for the stove and the sound of the wind picking up outside. The first real suggestion of cold weather coming. He straightened in the doorframe. "I should let you finish supper," he said. "Gavin," she said. He stopped. "Ask me what you're working up to asking me," she said. "I'm not going anywhere tonight." He looked at her for a moment. Then he came the rest of the way into the kitchen and sat down at the table, which was not the position of a man about to leave. "I don't know how to do this," he said. It's been 6 years and I'm not 25 and I don't." He stopped and started again. "There's a piece of land on the North Ridge, above where you first walked the fence line, overlooks the whole valley. I've been thinking about putting a house up there for a while, small one, just, I don't know, something separate from the main operation." He was not looking at her. "I want to know if you'd want to share it." The room was very quiet. "Are you asking me to stay?" she said. "I'm asking you to stay as more than the cook," he said. "However that looks, whatever pace it takes. I'm not asking for an answer about everything right now. I'm asking if you'd consider it." She looked at this man who was bad at speeches and honest in the way that mattered, and had stood in the rain with a rifle without his voice trembling, and had kept a photograph on the mantel for 6 years without apology. "I'd consider it," she said. He looked at her. She looked back. "That's enough," he said. And there was something in his voice that made it clear he meant it. That enough was genuinely enough. That he wasn't performing patience while expecting more. It was enough. He got up and went back to the office and his paperwork. And she turned back to the stove, and the kitchen was warm. And outside the wind was moving through the eaves of the house in that low sound she'd come to know over 5 months of mornings and evenings. She thought about her father's voice explaining subsurface drainage to a 12-year-old who kept asking why. Because water always finds a way, Bridget. You just have to stop blocking it. She thought he was talking about engineering. She'd been partially right. The federal case against Sterling Voss took the better part of a year to move through the system. These things always took longer than they should. The lawyers on Voss's side were expensive and effective at delay, and the county-level entanglements had to be unwound carefully. And there were weeks where Gavin received correspondence that gave no clear indication of how it would resolve. Bridget sat with him through some of those evenings. Not all of them. She wasn't going to pretend the process was less frustrating than it was. But she'd learned when to be present and when to let a man work through something alone. And she'd learned which one Gavin needed on which evening without having to ask. The widow Pierce reached out through Crane's office in the late fall. She'd seen the federal inquiry notice and understood for the first time that what had happened to her property had not been a run of bad luck. Gavin wrote back. Bridget helped him draft the letter, though she wouldn't claim it, and explained what the inquiry process had found and what her options might be. The woman wrote back 3 weeks later, a long letter, 3 pages, and at the end of it she said that, knowing it wasn't her fault, that she hadn't simply been weak or unlucky or inadequate, was worth more than she could explain. Bridget read that line and set the letter down and thought about it for a while. It was worth more than she could explain. That was the thing about injustice that didn't get talked about enough. The way it didn't only take property or livelihood, but ate at the story you told yourself about who you were and whether you deserved what had been taken. The widow Pierce had spent however many years believing she'd failed. The Calloway family, the brothers east of Harlan Creek, all of them carrying that weight. Voss hadn't just stolen land. He'd stolen the narrative. That was the thing worth being angry about. The financial damage could be assessed and potentially recovered. The years of believing you were the problem. That was harder to give back. She thought about her own version of that. The years of arriving somewhere and being assessed from the outside, the size of her, the plainness of her, the absence of the things people expected from a woman in her position, and the quiet, persistent work of not letting that assessment become the one she made of herself. It wasn't something she'd conquered once and been done with. It was something she managed daily, the way you managed a stove that ran slightly hot. You learned the adjustment and you made it without making a drama of it. The difference was knowing your own value before someone else confirmed it. Waiting for confirmation was how you ended up living on other people's terms. Sterling Voss was convicted on 7 of 9 counts in the spring. The sentencing was covered in the Carver City paper, which Roy brought back from a supply run and left on the kitchen table without comment. Bridget read it while she was waiting for bread to come out of the oven. Arson, conspiracy to commit fraud, criminal interference with agricultural operations, and 3 counts related to the fraudulent land surveys. The land he'd acquired from the other ranches was subject to a recovery proceeding. Not guaranteed, the legal process was complicated and not everyone would get everything back, but open. Crane had told the truth about the door. She folded the paper and set it aside and took the bread out. That evening at supper, she put it on the table, the paper, not the bread specifically, though both, and Gavin read the relevant section and set it down and nodded once and went back to eating. Roy said good, in the tone of a man for whom the word carried a significant weight. Cal read it and didn't say anything, but his jaw was tight in the way it went when something hit him somewhere real. Walt nodded once, same as Gavin. Denny said, 7 out of 9. What were the other 2? Procedural dismissals, Bridget said. Technicalities and how the charges were filed, not the substance. So he got the substance, Denny said. He got the substance, she said. The bread was good that night. She'd been trying a different proportion in the dough for 2 weeks and had finally landed on it. Nobody commented on this specifically, but the loaf disappeared faster than usual, which was the only review that mattered. The house on the North Ridge went up in early summer, after the trial was done and the inquiry formally closed and the worst of the rebuilding on the main property was finished. It was not large. 2 rooms and a porch and a kitchen that communicated with the main room in the way she'd described once to Gavin over the kitchen table one evening when he'd asked her what she'd want, if she could have anything. She'd been surprised he'd asked. She'd answered honestly anyway, which was the only way she knew how to answer questions that mattered. He'd built it the way she described. Roy came up the ridge the day it was finished, looked at it, walked around it once, and said to Gavin, "Good placement. You can see the whole lower valley from here." That was the idea, Gavin said. Roy looked at Bridget. She was standing on the porch looking out at the lower pastures, the green of them real now, the grass grown in thick where it had been bare cracked earth 8 months ago. The cattle were specks in the distance, moving slowly the way content cattle move without urgency. "The land looks right," Roy said. Not to anyone specifically, just an observation placed in the air. "It always did," Bridget said. "It just needed the blockage cleared." Roy was quiet for a moment. "You knew that from the beginning." "I thought I knew it," she said. "There's a difference. You think something, and then you do the work, and then you find out whether you were right. The thinking part isn't the hard part." He nodded slowly. "What's the hard part?" "Doing the work before you're sure," she said. "When you might be wrong and it'll cost something anyway." He looked at her for a moment. Roy was not a man who gave compliments often, and she'd stopped expecting them from him, which was fine. But he looked at her now with the kind of look that said, "I understand what you did, and I won't forget it." He didn't say any of that. He didn't have to. He turned and walked back down the ridge. She stayed on the porch. Gavin came and stood beside her, not crowding, just present, the way they'd learned to be in each other's space over the months. The valley spread out below them, wide and quiet, the creek running silver where it caught the late afternoon light. She thought about the woman who had arrived at this gate in the smoke of a burning barn, carrying a travel bag and a cook's notice. And she thought about what had happened in the months between that evening and this one, and she thought about what it meant to belong somewhere. She'd lived most of her life believing that belonging was something other people had. The ones who'd stayed in one place, who'd built the same thing for 20 years, who had people who expected them at a particular table on particular evenings. She'd been a traveler, a drifter by necessity, a person who arrived and was useful and eventually moved on. She'd made peace with that, or she'd thought she had. It was possible she'd just gotten very good at not examining it. But belonging wasn't just geography. It wasn't just staying. It was the accumulated weight of being known, of someone having watched you work through hard things and having not looked away. It was Roy's look at the top of the ridge. It was Cal digging fence post holes and saying my father never had land again. It was Walt appearing without being called because the situation needed him. It was Gavin Mercer building a house on the North Ridge to the specifications a drifter cook had described at a kitchen table one evening in the fall. You couldn't manufacture that. You couldn't rush it. You could only show up and do the work and be honest about what you were, and let the rest of it happen at whatever pace it took. She'd been doing that her whole life without knowing that was what it was. The valley below was gold and green in the late sun. Somewhere down the ridge, a horse made a sound, comfortable and unhurried. The wind was gentle for once, just enough to move through the grass to make the whole valley look alive. "You're staying," Gavin said. It was not quite a question. "I'm staying," she said. He nodded, and neither of them said anything else for a while, and that was all right. Some things don't need a speech. They need a person standing next to you at the end of a long day, looking at the same piece of ground, both of you understanding what it costs to keep it. Blackstone Ranch spread below them, imperfect, scarred in places, still carrying the marks of what it had been through, and alive. The grass was growing, the water was running, the people who worked the land knew what they were working for. That was enough. More than enough. It was the whole thing.